former Congressman Steve Israel, now the director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at the Brooks School at Cornell University. I want to welcome a global audience for a conversation on armed drones, limited war and strategic global contexts. Today, and as an informed and expert, a panel on drone warfare as can possibly be assembled. They'll explore the intended political and military benefits of armed drones, the legal, moral, and ethical implications, the unintended political, military, social, and economic costs of armed drones, emerging research for countries' use of armed drones, and much more. Before introducing our speakers, some very quick context. As you all know, it is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that gives Congress the authority to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government of and regulation of land and naval forces. I took that section particularly seriously because in most of my time in 16 years in Congress, I had the honor of serving on the Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense. But I must say that my own experience was that Congress did not effectuate sufficient oversight related to the drone program. If there were hearings, I don't recall them as a major focus of our committee work. Now, part of it was that the program had a certain opaqueness operated by the intel community and DOD, and that sometimes caused jurisdictional issues between committees. We had a top-line view that the Obama administration conducted more drone strikes in its first year than the prior 8 years in the Bush administration. We were properly focused on other critical issues, but in my view, insufficiently focused on a program that had become and continues to be a very significant component of American military operations. Well, today you will have a much deeper understanding of the implications of the evolving proliferation of drones for international security and global order. And I'm very proud to introduce our speakers. Paul Lushenko is a U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and General Andrew Jackson Goodpaster Scholar. He's in the Department of Government at Cornell University. Dr. Asfanjir Mir is a senior expert in the Asia Center at the United States Institute of Peace. Our moderator is Sarah Krebs. She is the John L. Wetherill Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell. And of course, John Brennan, 33 years of government experience, culminating in his service as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency under President Barack Obama from 2013 to 2017. He's now affiliated with the Fordham University Center on National Security. To our speakers, we are honored to have you with us. And Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. It's a real honor to moderate this panel. This is something that I have worked on for the last couple of decades. And during that time, drones have off and on made headlines. And right now, even as we speak, they're making headlines. Just last night, a US senator traveling in Poland cited drones for allowing Ukraine to level the playing field by taking out Russian air defense systems and convoys. So this drone is unusual. It doesn't look a lot like the American drones that we maybe came to see quite a bit in the news. It's assembled in Turkey, uses American and Canadian parts. It's cheaper than US made drones like the Reaper. And more importantly, the TB2, as it's called, and other drones skirt international regulation by flying under the radar. So drones have proliferated so widely after the US ushered in their use after 9/11. So beyond representing a staple of US counterterrorism strategy, drones are now used in completely different contexts, from disputes in Azerbaijan and Ukraine to conflicts in Ethiopia and Libya. So we're here to make sense of this evolving technology, and we have a stellar panel to help us answer these questions. How are drones changing war? Are they a virtue or a vice? And what does the future hold for these remote warfare capabilities? So to answer these questions, I'd like to go back before 9/11, and I want to start with John and to see whether he can set the stage with us in terms of the 1990s. So the counterterrorism environment and how we were approaching the terrorist threat. So after 9/11, Cofer Black, who was the former director of CIA's counterterrorism, said the gloves came off and we were no longer risk averse when it came to counterterrorism. So we would arm the predator with Hellfire missiles, but we didn't see a lot of counterterrorism strikes, as Steve was suggesting, until the Obama administration. And so I want to kind of put a couple of questions on the table here, kind of the 1990s, but also some of the questions about why then we escalated in the Obama administration. So there was a provocative book called Kill or Capture, which suggested that Obama's hope of closing Guantanamo meant that we couldn't capture terrorists, because we didn't have an obvious place to detain or try them, so we should kill them instead. So this seemed kind of compelling circumstantially, but is this really the case? So I wonder, Director Brennan, whether you could take us back a little bit and kind of paint this arc of where armed drones had come from and why they went from unarmed to armed and then sort of latent relatively and then escalatory.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for the invitation to participate in today's panel, which I think is an important one. But as you point out, I think there's some historical context that's very important to set the stage with. Certainly throughout the 1990s, as al-Qaeda was gaining strength, the United States counterterrorism effort was designed to prevent attacks, uncover operatives, uncover plots, and do everything possible to prevent them from taking place. And so therefore, with the drone technology that was just emerging at that time, it was unarmed drones that were used for surveillance in certain parts of the world. After 9/11, in light of the devastating attacks that took place on that day, the United States decided to go on the offensive and take the battle to al-Qaeda, which meant that there was going to be operations directed against the terrorists overseas, again, to prevent them from carrying out attacks, but to destroy the al-Qaeda network. And so a couple of things are important, I think, taking a look at the period during the Bush administration, the Obama administration. Two particular points. First, there was a tremendous evolution in the technology as well as the attendant infrastructure related to drones. There were two principal types of platforms, these unmanned, remotely piloted vehicles. The first one, which was the initial Predator, which was the MQ-1, which initially, again, was used for surveillance, full motion video. And after 9/11, there was an increase in terms of the availability of these drones, but also quite a bit of technological advancements that were done in light of the United States' offensive war against al-Qaeda. The other drone is the MQ-9, the Reaper, which is a much more formidable platform. It's larger, it's faster, it flies higher, can carry a lot more ordnance. And so throughout the course of the Bush administration, this evolution was taking place. And so the capabilities, the technological capabilities that were available to US counterterrorism forces increased in terms of quantity as well as sophistication. And so that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is, as you know, the primary battlefields at the time were in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the initial deployment of these platforms, both MQ-1s and MQ-9s, were almost exclusively focused on those two areas of active hostilities. However, as we saw that al-Qaeda was spreading its wings, and a lot of al-Qaeda went into Pakistan, but also the growth of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula inside of Yemen, and also inside of Somalia, there was a need to be able to bring this offensive effort against al-Qaeda beyond the areas of active hostilities. So in the last year of the Bush administration, I think there were 200 or 300 strikes, drone strikes inside of Afghanistan and Iraq, because again, the US military was focusing on that area. By the time the Obama administration came into power in January of 2009, we were handed a capability that was emerging in terms of its robustness and its utility against the terrorist target. And so we were handed those capabilities, but we really weren't handed any playbook in terms of how and where to operationalize those drones outside of the areas of active hostilities. So inside of Iraq and Afghanistan, it was really the military's rules of engagements that prevailed in those areas in terms of striking hostile forces. But then in the Obama administration, we utilized these platforms in order to go after the terrorists that were hiding out beyond those two countries. And with the increasing capabilities of the drones and the precision that they allowed, and the ability to put ordnance on a target with tremendous precision, you were able to carry out these strikes and greatly reducing the prospects for civilian casualties. And so it brings me to the next point, which is, you mentioned that book, Capture or Kill. I must say, during the Obama administration, I was never aware of any action that we took with a drone that was targeting a terrorist, where we had the option to capture, detain, or arrest the individuals. It was only because we didn't have any other recourse that we took these actions. Now, there were a lot of individuals who were captured and taken off of the battlefield in the years after 9/11. And they were turned over to the US military and others. But by the end of the Bush administration and the exposure of the detention interrogation program, the enhanced interrogation techniques, and the black sites, the appetite for foreign governments to turn over individuals to the US government really basically diminished significantly. But when we had the opportunity to capture individuals, we did. There's a good case, individual named Ahmed Warsami, who was traveling from between Somalia and Yemen, who was captured by US forces on the high seas and then brought aboard a US naval ship for, I think it was 60 or 90 days and interrogated. And there were lots and lots of individuals who were detained by US military forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this narrative that the Obama administration decided to kill rather than capture is really without foundation, at least from my experience. That, again, is the playbook that we released in terms of the framework, which was the presidential policy guidance that was issued in May of 2013. It noted that we would only take and use these drones and take a lethal strike against a terrorist when there was no option for capture or detention. So again, I think it's important to keep in mind this evolution of the technology, of the capabilities, both of the platforms as well as the payloads. And by payloads, I'm talking about the missiles, the ordnance, whether it be the Hellfire missiles, the GBUs, as well as the collection systems, the improvements in the full motion video that took place during this time that you could see with much greater fidelity and accuracy, the signals collection payloads that were on these platforms as well. So again, there was increasing sophistication, robustness, and capability of these platforms over time. And the Obama administration putting in place a process for the approval of these strikes, again, felt as though this was the best option to prevent additional terrorist attacks from claiming innocent lives. And remember, there was an increase in the number of attempted attacks against the homeland in 2009 and the years afterward, coming out of Yemen, coming out of Pakistan and other areas. So again, I think that context is important. I think people believe that the Obama administration basically flipped a light switch when it came on and decided to use these drones much more extensively. It was because there was a maturation of the capability that coincided with the Obama administration time in office.
Yeah, that was incredibly helpful context, Dr. Brennan. And so one of the things I'd like to do, because the frequency and prevalence of these strikes really set off a lot of study as to whether they were effective, whether they were legal and legitimate. And I want to turn to two kind of academic perspectives on this, starting with Dr. Mir, who has done an incredible job studying this campaign in Pakistan in depth and the efficacy of strikes in Yemen and Northwest Syria. How should we think about this question of effectiveness? Has the US government been successful in achieving what it sets out to do with these drone strikes?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me. Thank you to Representative Israel and the Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs for convening this discussion. Really delighted to be a part of this with you, Director Brennan, Paul, taking a retrospective as well as prospective look at the armed drone, which I believe is one of the major strategic developments of this post 9/11 era. And to think about effectiveness, I think it is really important to correctly situate the historical context. What prompted the use of drones, as well as what was the political logic behind deploying them. And here I'm going to echo some of the points that Director Brennan has made, but from a slightly different perspective and different sources of data as well. So as I read the historical record of U.S. counterterrorism policy, by the early part of the Iraq War, the U.S. government was really struggling with the growing number of threats from several safe havens and weak states. The Pakistan safe haven was a particularly big problem, but there were some other safe havens as well. And while the threat from these havens was multi-directional, the principal challenge which concerned decision makers at the time was, an unrelenting stream of threats of attacks against U.S. homeland territories. So, Al-Qaeda, in my mind, was plotting mass casualty attacks at a very high tempo, had a lot of capacity, I have no doubt about that, and in some cases, even hitting allied territories at the time. More regime change was not an answer in places where these threats were metastasizing. It only made the problem worse, as Iraq demonstrated. And partner governments, they lacked intent. At times, they lacked the capacity to help meaningfully. So that was a big problem. So I think it was a combination of these pressures which led the US government to, at times implicitly, at times explicitly right-size its end state on the terror problem, from defeating to managing terror threats. And in this framework of managing threats, I believe three strategic rationales emerged, starting with, late Bush, early Obama years, and I think these rationales really crystallized during the course of the Obama years. And the unmanned armed drone really was at the center of these rationales. The first one was of the first rationale logic was of decimating substantial organizational and political capital of terror groups, what I call the logic of degradation. And this option was pursued against Al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan at a very high tempo, starting late 2008 and going through 2014, even parts of 2015. And I believe the US government was extremely effective at degrading Al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan using drones, at both damaging and then really constraining Al-Qaeda Central's political echelon and operational capabilities. So as you mentioned, my work, it documents the intense pressure that drone warfare brought on Al-Qaeda core, destroying, among other critical capital, its main international terror plotting capability at the time, which undoubtedly made the US homeland much more secure. The second rationale of use of drones was this interdiction of middle to late stage violent threats, what I call the logic of disruption. And in this logic, the US government pursued select nodes, not the entire organization, of key Al-Qaeda affiliates. And later on, this was also pursued against ISIS, nodes that were involved in plotting attacks and threatening key regional US interests. And this approach was most clearly evident in Yemen against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, starting in late 2009, early 2010. And initially, it wasn't as effective, but in later years, it certainly was. And the third rationale of use of armed drones, which I think is relatively recent, was to use precision targeting to alter the political aims of the targets. And this logic really shaped US campaigns in Somalia and more recently in Northwest Syria. In both places, the US government sought to pressure groups to steer away from anti-US political platforms and ambitions. And I'd say the record in pursuit of this objective has been mixed. I mean, in Syria, we see that the dominant jihadi faction there has shifted its political focus away from anti-US goals. But in Somalia, the main group there, Shabab, still expresses strong anti-US aims, and Shabab looks pretty strong even now. Now, there have been persistent concerns about efficacy on, about civilian harm in these strikes, and some argued that civilian harm makes battlefield gains very difficult. You can't get intelligence if you keep harming civilians. That's one argument. The other one is that civilian harm counteracts any potential gains by radicalizing populations. That drones create more terrorists. I partially agree that armed drones are not as surgical as was argued during the Obama years. We now have evidence that they are disruptive. They unsettle, unnerve civilians in these battlefields. And in Yemen, we have good scholarly work showing that civilians were compelled to flee in the immediate aftermath of strikes. However, in Pakistan, as well as Yemen, what I find is that the targeted terror groups really struggle to channel civilian harm to their benefit. So in Pakistan, I find no meaningful evidence of Al-Qaeda or its Pakistani partners having more recruits available to them due to civilian harm in these strikes, as well as radicalization of the local population. I just don't find it to be a dominant process in some of my work. That said, I think the global backlash to drone strikes during the Obama years was very real. It's hard to dispute. And I think drones really came to epitomize the intrusive nature of US military power, which contributed to narratives favorable to terror groups.
So I appreciate you bringing up the question of civilian casualties, because that's a big part of the criticism about their use, which is that we can use precision munitions, we can engage in the loitering that allows us to kind of make better decisions. But if you don't have the good intelligence, you might precisely target the wrong person or people, as we saw in August 2021 in Kabul. And so I want to turn this over to Colonel Lushenko to talk about the civilian side of this. So now you've been involved with drone operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, but you also now are researching this question about civilian casualties and legitimacy. So I wonder if you could kind of speak to those questions.
Yeah, Sarah, thank you so much for the question, and for everybody else on the panel. Really appreciate the opportunity to share not just my expertise in the military managing the intelligence of these strikes, much like Director Brennan, at a tactical and operational, and indeed I think strategic level, but also my research and bridging, as it were, the gap between academia, policy, and practitioners who do this on a daily basis and are highly professional in doing so. And so when you take a look at the legitimacy of drone operations, this is a highly fraught topic for a variety of reasons. One is that we're not really sure what legitimacy means. Is it compliance pull from international humanitarian law or the laws of armed conflict that govern these strikes? And on the other hand, there's an argument that legitimacy comes down to the subjective beliefs in the appropriateness of wartime conduct by states, which comes down to people and how they believe. And so it's really challenging to study legitimacy as a dependent variable. But yet we know that people have intuitions that we can tap into through interesting research design, such as survey experiments. So in my research, what I find is really one of three predominant legitimacy arguments. The first is that legitimacy for drone strikes comes down to battlefield courage, the amount of courage that a soldier puts him or herself into positions of vulnerability. And if we're not doing so, then really drones smack up, because they're unmanned and pilotless, post-heroic warfare. The other sort of argument for legitimacy turns that on its head and argues that states, officials, presidents have obligations to use drone strikes because of the force protection dividends gained from doing so. The principle of so-called unnecessary risk, which is highly prolific within the ethical and philosophical literature surrounding drone usage. And then finally is the key aspect of international humanitarian law for the protection of civilians, the notion of non-combatant immunity. And indeed, I think this is really the leading or flagship argument for legitimacy, which is that strikes should protect against civilian casualties. As opposed to simply the consequences, my research takes a different track and identifies the causal structure of strikes as being equally, if not more important. And let me explain what I mean by that. I believe that there are different uses of drone strikes, to include tactical uses, such as a patrol or raid, or a veritable strategy, which we saw on display with the strike that was authorized by the Trump administration against Qasem Soleimani, a major general that kind of pulled the strings of paramilitary groups in Iran. So the tactic and strategic use of drone warfare is not well recognized within the literature or even the practitioner community. And on the other hand, we also have different types of constraints. One constraint would be the constraint that Director Brennan talked about, which was the presidential planning guidance for near certainty of no civilian casualties, a unilateral constraint which is imposed by officials within a state. But on the other hand, we know certain legitimacy dividends come from United Nations Security Council approval for drone strikes, much like France attempts to achieve and has achieved for nearly a decade, conducting strikes against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State within Western Africa, the Sahel region. And so I propose that when you vary the use and constraint of drones, you actually get different outcomes for public perceptions of legitimacy. Now, this is not just a fanciful sort of middle range theory, as we call it. It actually has real empirical purchase within the world and people's intuition. So I ran, as you know, Sarah, a survey experiment of nearly 1,000 American respondents of March of this last year, where I varied the use and constraint of drones. What I found was, one, there was a significant moderating effect for perceptions of legitimacy as identified by these respondents for certain uses and constraints of drones. The second key outcome is that the tactical use of drone strikes like a patrol or raid with multilateral approval, as is the case in Mali with French drone strikes, is viewed as the most legitimate sort of model of drone strikes globally. And then finally, we can't reify moral legitimacy, as I call it, to one moral norm or the next, which is to say battlefield courage, protection for soldiers, or duties of care to civilians. But often what happens when you vary use and constraint is different moral norms firing because people are pulling on different sort of normative frameworks within their sort of intracranial mechanisms. So this is great sort of academic speak, but what's the real implication going forward for how these operations are conducted by the US and other countries? Well, I think there's two key points here. The first is we have to be aware that the way that we use drones as a tactic strategy with different oversight, unilateral and multilateral, can cause perceptions of legitimacy to shift. And if we're going to conduct a strategic strike with unilateral controls like we've done in Afghanistan towards the withdrawal of this operation in August 29th of this year, we have to be aware that the outcomes could go a certain way that results in shaping our narrative for why we conducted these strikes in the first place. The other sort of key outcome comes down to global governance, which we should talk about later. But whereas we often view US strikes as being most problematic because they're unilateral and they're strategic, I often find in my research that it's the tactical use of drones with unilateral controls that's taking place in Azerbaijan, in Ethiopia, in Libya, which is the real global governance challenge that most scholars haven't identified, and if they have, really haven't contended with in terms of regulatory regimes.
So I appreciate all of those comments, Paul, and we're going to get to proliferation and governance a little bit if we can later. I want to kind of bring it to the domestic accountability question with Director Brennan that Representative Israel had, I think, offered a great provocation at the beginning, at the outset of the call about what he saw as the lack of accountability within the legislative oversight capacity. And so I'm curious whether you could speak to that question, John, and not just kind of on the question of domestic oversight, but we've heard a little bit about just sort of in the open press about different jurisdictions, kind of Title IX versus Title 50 for DOD versus CIA carrying out the strikes. I wonder if you could kind of fold that in, and if you could, the third about a question that's coming up in the one of the listeners, the interaction between these decisions that are being made within the US side and the local governments, in other words, the countries in which these strikes are taking place.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that certainly during the Obama administration, lethal action was only taken against terrorist targets, and members of these terrorist organizations are illegitimate combatants under international law. Unlike Qasem Soleimani, as was mentioned by Paul, the strike that was done in the Trump administration, it was an official of a sovereign government. And that's something that I really do think is a whole nother issue. It's one that I criticize. I don't like the idea, particularly with the proliferation of drones, that drones would be used by one country to kill the officials of another country. When we carried out these strikes in countries outside of areas of active hostilities, it was done with the concurrence, basically the general approval of the host governments. I traveled to the region numerous times when I was working in the Obama administration, during the first 4 years as President Obama's counterterrorism advisor to these countries to talk about these types of strikes and the modalities as well as the parameters that they could be carried out in. And then the issue regarding Title 10 and Title 50, this is under the U.S. Code. Title 10 is the law under which U.S. military activities take place. Title 50 is that which intelligence agencies operate under, including covert action. And covert action is a very specific type of U.S. action that is undertaken to influence political, economic, military conditions abroad and it's done in a manner to not acknowledge that U.S. government role or involvement. And so there's a big difference, not only in terms of the authorities under which these actions are carried out, but also the oversight of these activities by Congress. And as Representative Israel rightly said, I think for the armed services, for the military services, there is not as maybe rigorous oversight role for the committees as maybe some members of Congress would like. That the activities that take place under the Secretary of Defense's authorities are briefed to members of Congress, the committees of jurisdiction. For the intelligence activities that take place under Title 50, including covert action, this is the realm of the intelligence committees, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, that have the role of being kept fully and currently informed of all of those activities. And so on the drone program, if there are activities that the military carries out, they have a responsibility to report to the extent that the law requires to the Armed Services and the Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee on Defense, and any covert action activities that take place by CIA or others. There's responsibility on the part of the agency officials to testify in closed classified sessions to those oversight committees. So there is a real distinction, but again, in law, covert action requires that there be no acknowledgement of these types of programs or activities. Sometimes after the fact, covert action is revealed. So for example, the CIA's detention interrogation program, which was carried out under its Title 50 covert action authorities, at the time was unacknowledged, but then it was subsequently decided to reveal that this was indeed a U.S. intelligence community CIA program. So again, it limits what the CIA or what the government can reveal publicly about some of these programs on the covert action front, including those that involve some very specific activities on the counterterrorism front.
Yeah, that's really helpful because, one of the things Paul studies public opinion, and it does seem as though if these policies are not part of public debate, there's sort of a limit of what is percolating down to the public for the public to even kind of interpret. Paul, maybe I can go back to you now and kind of bring us a little bit forward now to what we're seeing in Ukraine. So we know that drones really had become very visible as a tool of U.S. counterterrorism, and now we're really seeing them be seemingly quite decisive in the Ukraine context. And so maybe people watching have seen footage of these Turkish-made drones looking like they're striking their targets. And yet it's very interesting because, again, this is quite a different context. Could you kind of get into that a little bit? What are we seeing? What are people watching? What is this new context in which we're looking at the use of armed drones?
Yeah, it's an important question because, of course, we know that the purpose of drone strikes can shift based upon the strategic context of conflict. You have written about this with a colleague, Sarah Maxey, right? So drones can aid, they can watch, and they can kill. They're useful in irregular warfare, urban conflict, and indeed humanitarian crises. And what are we seeing unfold right now? So I think there's a real problem with the public generally, but maybe even some experts out there in essentializing drone warfare to the platform itself. And therefore, we align or attempt to align our countermeasures against undermining the capability itself, the end item, the platform, the MQ-1, the MQ-9, the TB2, the Punisher, the Spectre, whatever number of these shapes and sizes of drones that are available to militaries, big and small. My contention in countering these capabilities, which have been quite effective, it's asymmetrical that we would exploit vulnerabilities for even Western militaries. It's not just radically asymmetric violence. It's now exploiting vulnerabilities in key Western militaries to defend against these platforms. I think the problem is our capabilities are trying to do that. What we have to do is get left of boom and what we say in the military is get left of launch of these capabilities to undermine them from even taking off from an aircraft or a landing strip in the first place. So let me explain what that means practically. I think that we have to focus on the supply chain that makes some of these capabilities dual use. So certainly the DJI and other commercial off-the-shelf capabilities have commercial application, but also they're weaponized. And we just saw recently a DJI drone dropping a Molotov cocktail against Russian military forces. And this thing cost penny on the dollars compared to $1 billion program for the General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper. So the supply chain management and trying to interdict some of these parts and components before they get added into an end-item capability is the first course of action. The other thing to note is that although it's out of sight and out of mind, these large, medium drones, whether it's a TB2 from Turkey or the General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper, require substantial infrastructure, what we call sort of the tooth to tail ratio in the military. We're talking hundreds of personnel, maintainers, logistical people, analysts, so on and so forth. And so there are expeditionary bases from which you can undermine these operations by striking those as critical capabilities, but also critical vulnerabilities. And finally, in terms of phase 3 is this operation, as I've kind of painted here, to undermine these capabilities, you have to take a look at the intelligence. Assuming you have the infrastructure, you have the capability, there's a global spanning intelligence network that undergirds these sort of large and medium size operations. And so if you can take out some of the human enablers that gathers intelligence, some of the fixed site that gathers intelligence, then it stands the reason that you can undermine the operations even before these platforms fly. And so I think we have to take a better look at the key vulnerabilities before the platforms in the air to really redress what's going on in places like Libya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and elsewhere.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to turn to a couple of questions from our audience that do kind of engage some of the themes and conversations we've been having so far. And so this question comes from Tomez Toyama. The question about whether strikes made sense in a counterterrorism fight, but what about, quote, at the edges of war with peer regional competitors such as Russia, China, or Iran? So I think that's an interesting question, and we could answer that from a couple of different perspectives. Curious whether we have anyone who wants to take the debate there, maybe Director Brennan.
I can start. I think the use of drones in conventional military conflicts is quite robust. When I think about some of the conflicts, we had the conflict with Azerbaijan, Abkhazia, that the drones can take out tanks from great distance. And one of the benefits about drones, as we've talked about, they're remotely piloted. They're not manned platforms, so you really reduce the risk to that limited supply of pilots that you have. It's a standoff weapon. It's one that it can be utilized effectively, particularly to stop forces that are moving into certain areas where they're open and then subject to strikes from a distance. So I do think they play a very important role. And also, when you go after terrorist targets, you frequently are trying to disaggregate those on the ground. Who is the terrorist and who's the civilian and whatever else. But if you're going against conventional military, you're basically hitting anyone that's from the opposing side. So I think they have wide application, certainly, in conventional conflicts, as we're seeing right now, again, in Ukraine.
But one of the things that seems interesting now in this context is that the drones, they fly low, they fly slow, they should be a pretty easy target. And so I think there had been a view, I've certainly made this argument, that they wouldn't be as useful in a South China Sea context where you have a lot of kind of the air defenses are quite advanced, which raises, I think, a question about where the technology is going and whether there are these limitations in an interstate conflict that don't happen to be present in the somewhat idiosyncratic context of Ukraine, and kind of what those advances might look like.
Well, again, one of the main benefits of a drone platform is its intelligence collection capability. The fact that it can observe forces and it can do that from a distance, and the fact that the Reaper doesn't fly that slow. I think it was 3 times the speed of the MQ-1, the Predator. It can fly at pretty good distance heights, and it has that the opportunity to dwell. Yes, there are air defense capabilities that puts it at risk, but it can also fly low and below some of the radar. That and the different types of technologies and the composite materials that some of these platforms now, I think, are going to be using brings up also the question or the issue of their stealthiness, to be able to penetrate air defense systems in a manner that allows them to get in and out without having the same type of signatures that make them more vulnerable.
Well, do you want to jump in here on the question of interstate or vulnerabilities of current generation drones?
I think Asfander may have his hand up. Did you want to? I'm more than happy to, but I don't want to jump the queue.
Sure. Yeah, I can add in. So I think one of the debates we've been having in political science, IR security studies is about escalation risk and what emerging tech is doing to escalation dynamics. And specifically the question of, are UAVs, drones, are they escalation stabilizing, destabilizing? Are there ways in which we can control escalation, that might be otherwise harder with the help of these platforms? So, on the one hand, there's this argument that drones, UAVs are unmanned. So, if an unmanned platform is brought down, the risk of escalation is lower. There's likely to be less political pressure on political leaders to escalate in response to a shot down drone platform. And, I think there is some evidence of that, in some of the exchanges the United States government has had with, say, the Iranians, the Global Hawk being brought down. We didn't see that kind of escalation pressure, which we might have seen had a pilot gone down in Iranian territory. But on the other hand, some of the improvements we're seeing in tech, the stealth dimension, is particularly concerning. If drones become more penetrating, right? If they're able to reach targets which otherwise, states believe that that are relatively secure. If they're able to collect intelligence which states otherwise think that that their adversaries are unlikely to lay their hands on, I think drones, UAVs become much more escalatory. So the technological trend lines are concerning, and I think they have the potential to add to some of these escalation risks.
So I may just add, I think that Asfander is absolutely correct. In fact, there's a stream of IR research right now coming out of MIT with Eric Lee and Greenberg that talks about escalation relative to different forms of conflict, soft raids, special operation forces, a drone strike, whatever it may be. And so I think there's more room to study this empirically, as he's mentioned. I will just tell you that I do believe that drones have become integrated within sort of conventional conflicts, as Director Brennan has stated. But I do believe the jury, on the other hand, is also still out on what this means. Is it a game changer? Are we changing the character versus the nature of warfare, which is a separate conversation altogether? I'm often asked this question from practitioners. And so for the purposes of that audience right now, to what extent are drones useful in a state-on-state conflict, such as the United States versus any number of near-peer competitors? I think that there's marginal gains to be made from these platforms, the survivability of which is potentially dubious in a hot war against a large near-peer competitors. What that looks like potentially is using the sort of persistent ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability of drones to police up a marshaling or staging area. We could also use drones to protect what we call the FLOT, which is the forward line of troops that comes in contact with a near-peer competitor. And then also, I think that there's an ability, much like we saw in World War II with coastal artillery in Leyte Gulf or other sort of engagements of shaping fires, to use drones in terms of long or deep fires, not necessarily just what we call CAS or CCA, which is close combat attack or close air support. And so I think we still have to study this empirically within the military channels. And there's a lot of think tanks and military organizations that are designed to do that. But frankly, we haven't been in a position where we've tested this, and nor would we want to. And so maybe it's one of these things where we kind of feel as we go and adjust as we go as well for their use within a conventional conflict with a near-peer competitor.
I just wanted to add, from the standpoint of being able to integrate the drone capability into a broader sort of combined effort, it really, I think, depends on the capabilities, the broader military capabilities of forces. The United States military, I think, is absolutely the best in terms of being able to integrate capabilities, whether you're talking about on the ground, drones, satellites, other types of things, while other nations do not have that same array of capabilities and intelligence and expertise and analysis and whatever else. And so the ability to nest those drones within that broader array of capabilities, I think, is critically important.
So that, I think, is one of the questions I've been thinking about as we've been chatting is, Director Brennan, when, your history with these programs goes back quite a bit. Is this something that was contemplated, not just how the US would use drones, but kind of the question of whether this would be a model or for other states or non-state actors? I mean, one of the reasons why this isn't maybe as proliferation might not be as much of a concern is for the reasons you suggested. There's this whole infrastructure that's necessary to actually do the kind of global strikes the United States is doing. But I'm just curious, kind of behind the scenes, was there conversation about, if the US is doing this now in 2009, were other countries going to try to emulate this model of warfare? And are we worried about that?
I think there's always been those questions and concerns. I can remember in early 2001, before the 9/11 attacks, when we were able to use unarmed drones over certain areas in South Asia, where we were actually able to see bin Laden. And I think it was at that time when people said, oh my goodness, this is a tremendous capability, that if it were armed, it would be able to take these actions. And then over time, and particularly during the Obama administration, as drone technology became much more sophisticated and was proliferating in terms of capability, size, whatever else, there was a real concern, including here in the United States, about the drones that are operated near airports and other types of things in terms of their utility, but also the risks that they pose. And so I think, as has been said, this brings a totally new feature and dimension to the use of lethal strikes, whether it be by sovereign states or by organizations or by individuals or whatever. We've been talking about armed drones as opposed to lethal drones, which are basically drones, platforms that have IEDs on them, explosives on them, and then directed into a target, which is very worrisome from the standpoint of it being able to be done, basically in, anywhere. So how do you govern? How do you manage? How do you limit the proliferation, their use? It's a real question. I think it's one of the many questions during this technological era that we're in about these capabilities that are now easily obtainable and can be used for less than good purposes.
Mm-hmm. If I might just stay with you for a second, because there's a question for you from one of our attendees here today, Nick Moturn, engaging with your comment about drone operators experiencing PTSD and moral injury and other psychological damage as a result of this program. Again, when you deploy a technology, you can't always know ex ante what the consequences will be. How significant an issue is this?
I think it is quite significant, and I'm sure Paul and Sponder can comment on this as well, because when you are carrying out a strike from an armed drone and they're laser guided, you actually follow the ordnance to the target. And with the full motion video, you actually see what happens when that ordnance hits the target. Unlike somebody who is just firing an artillery shell or from great distance, missile strikes, whatever else, the pilots, the weaponeers, they are actually seeing the effects of these very powerful weapons that hit the target. And just like others within the military who have to witness the effects of conflict and war, it does take a toll. Sometimes people think that there's an impersonal aspect to the use of drone warfare. Well, maybe for some, but for those who actually are doing this, and if they make mistakes, particularly as far as civilian deaths that unfortunately result from some strikes, it can have a real traumatic effect and impact on the operators and those who were involved. So I do think it's a feature because it really brings up close and personal, again, the results of those strikes.
Sarah, I may just add real quick, agree with everything that the director has said. There's this real sort of line of argument out there that we respatialize war. It's not as heroic, it's riskless, it's war by the desk, so to speak. I'm not really sure what that means, because what we're really looking at here is the tension between the shifting character versus nature of warfare. And I think that we have to put this front and center when we talk about the adoption of especially armed drones. Is it simply changing the way that conflict's conducted, which is the character? Or is there real traction for the nature of warfare in these sort of enduring social and political axes? And I will tell you that I think it's quite dubious. I think this is a game changer, this technology, for the nature of warfare. What we know about the nature of warfare is that it's intensely human, right? It's a clash of wills. It's highly political, and it's fraught with uncertainty. And I think in some cases, armed drones and these drone operators feel that more intimately than even those on the ground, because of the persistent stare of targets, as the director has talked about. And this opens up a whole can of worms for the science surrounding moral injury. But suffice it to say here, given the time constraints, there are people who study this, and there's real implications for these drone strikes on psychology and moral injury. And I think what the military has done to counteract this is to try to inculcate a culture of resiliency that would allow people to withstand the sort of trauma they may experience in doing these strikes habitually over the course of decades.
Yeah, it's great. And Asmandar, if you want to comment on that, that's great. I might also kind of turn to a question that I have that connects with this conversation, which is that the Biden administration came into office with kind of a not really a playbook either, and has been evaluating this question of what sort of standards it would require for targeting. It also, though, has withdrawn from Afghanistan, but has promised to kind of keep America safe from a counterterrorism perspective. So do you think this is kind of the right way to thread that needle? Or what are the perils of these, what are referred to as over-the-horizon strikes? Is this too good to be true? How should we be thinking about this? And, what guidance would you give to the Biden administration in terms of how to be thinking about these over-the-horizon strikes and what it really needs to be keeping in mind?
Sarah, look, I'm on the side of these strikes having a real disruptive and degradation effect, which is sufficient to manage the problem, keeping the threat at bay. So I don't dispute what drones might be able to achieve on the battlefield if they're used. But the main challenge I foresee with this over-the-horizon approach that the administration has been talking about is whether drones or similar platforms can actually be called into action the same way as we saw in, say, Pakistan 2008 to 2015, or Yemen even. Some regions where current threats and future threats might emerge, this strategy makes a lot of sense. But in others, I see major challenges. And so one major challenge is of access, pure access to the theater of operations. So take the case of Afghanistan. The administration is claiming that it can implement an over-the-horizon strategy there to prevent groups from meaningfully re-emerging and threatening U.S. allied territories. But Afghanistan is a landlocked country. The U.S. doesn't have any type of bases, proximate bases, to position surveillance and strike assets, in particular in Afghanistan's neighborhood, not in Central Asian republics, neither in Pakistan, certainly not in Iran. And moreover, in these campaigns of the past, what we see is that the United States has leaned on partner governments to an extent. And these relationships have provided important, even if limited, resources to prosecute counterterrorism campaigns. But in Afghanistan, we have the Taliban in charge, and even minimal help from the de facto state authority there is questionable. I mean, the Taliban are part of the terrorism problem there, which I think will really complicate campaigning. The second key challenge, and I think this ties to a question you asked earlier as well, I think, over the horizon strategy is difficult amid intensifying great power competition, and especially with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the trend lines are worrying. Until now, the US government has pursued these campaigns without any major concern about major power rivals, what they will do. And in places, I think it's arguable that Russia and China have even been nominally supportive of US campaigns. For example, in northwest Syria, the Russians have deconflicted airspace in a way which has enabled drone surveillance for counterterrorism operations. And the Chinese haven't helped US's terror adversaries countermeasures that can bring down drones. I think that will change. And two specific challenges that I foresee are, one, great powers or major powers like Russia and China, they will block US access to critical theaters of operations. And I'm especially concerned about Afghanistan, where I think the Chinese and the Russians have incentives to obstruct US surveillance and strike operations. And a second challenge that I foresee, especially in light of this discussion that the US might arm a Ukrainian insurgency resistance that might emerge in case the Ukrainian military collapses. I think major power rivals like Russia, China can provide countermeasures and technologies to US's adversaries to thwart these drone surveillance and strike platforms. So put another way, I think great power competition can spill into counterterrorism that's likely, and which will make the conduct of these over-the-horizon campaigns over the long haul fairly difficult.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to have time for just a really quick comment from Director Brennan. I want to turn to this question of open source intelligence. It's been fascinating to watch the use of OSINT in Ukraine. We can follow real-time Russian convoys. And I know that this is something you've talked about in the context of our intelligence community and the role of social media. How should we think about the role of the intelligence community's kind of responsibilities, risks in this new information age?
But the challenge these days is not the dearth of information. The challenge is the overwhelming volume of information that runs the gamut from accurate, verifiable information to the most bogus. And the intelligence community now taps into as much of that open source information as possible. Again, things like satellite imagery that is available, worldwide, but the U.S. government has a lot of additional satellite imagery, but the social media that is just so prevalent, and that which is coming from foreign intelligence services and sources intended to misinform, disinformation that is out there, it is really quite difficult. And that's why having data analysts and others be able to pour through this information and again, seek a way to correlate information and pick out from open source, clandestinely acquired sources, human, technical, whatever else, as a way to validate and to verify the information. That's where there is a tremendous need to have really strong technology capabilities, but also the expertise, the analysis, in order to ensure that policymakers, as well as operators, have the most accurate picture of reality. But it is increasingly a challenge. And I think as we see the digital domain expanding, it's just going to make this even more of a daunting challenge to those who have the responsibility to try to discern the truth, whether or not you're operating drones or whether or not you're trying to figure out how best to support your allies and partners or to defeat your adversaries. It's the challenge, I think, of the 21st century.
Well, it's given us a lot to think about. I appreciate all these comments, the insights from our panelists, and we appreciate the audience tuning in here. I know that this will not be the last we've heard of about armed drones or social media or the information age. So I really appreciate our panelists kind of integrating these ideas and appreciate the audience for tuning in. Thanks, everyone.